Nice. Well, let's see how it progresses. But that's enough about COVID for now. Let's move on to the G7. The G7. Let me bring up this article from, I think it's Reuters. Yeah, Reuters. At Japan's G7 summit, the big elephants are China and Russia. Well, shock horror. They've definitely got not much to talk about among themselves otherwise. But as you guys know, the G7 met in Japan, and they met in Hiroshima. Like I don't understand that, especially with the history. And some of the things they said there, it was just absolutely embarrassing. Now, we heard a new term, de-risking instead of decoupling. I just can't even keep up anymore. And we also saw some really hideous comments out of the British Prime Minister. Now, I don't even know how to pronounce his name. He'll be gone soon anyway. Rishi Sunak. Sunak, who says that China poses the biggest challenge of our age to global security and prosperity. Now, I just think this is absolutely, I don't want to swear, and I won't, but it's absolutely effing stupid. And there's a really good tweet that I want to share from Arnaud Bertrand, who's actually a really amazing tweeter. I'll just read it and then we'll discuss. He said, insane gaslighting. How does China being the biggest challenge to global prosperity square with the fact that 75% of the reduction of global poverty these past 40 years is thanks to China? How does China being the biggest challenge to global security square with the fact that China's development was entirely peaceful and that China hasn't as much as fired a single bullet abroad in 40 plus years? Now, as we know, that was just a border skirmish between Vietnam in 1979. I think these 2 points are made very, very well. What do you think, Eric?
I mean, I would say the first 2 words, touche, it's such typical gaslighting. What does it mean? It means that, someone who is actually the perpetrator calling the victims, the criminals.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just, as a regular Chinese people, I would feel offended when they say China is the biggest threat to security and global peace and everything. It just doesn't make any sense on any grounds. They are simply trying to manipulate these type of what we call, concepts and repeat these sets of narratives to a certain group of audience who don't have otherwise any other access to understanding China or Chinese people. So when they repeat these concepts, when they repeat such a claim that baits really negative emotions out of people, they can make it a reality somehow when they repeat it over and over again, right? We have similar idioms in English or in Chinese. When a lie is repeated a million times, it becomes a fact. So I think they're just trying to take a bad initiative at fabricating these just really ungrounded claims that target China as the bad person always, while these G7, countries are bullies in many aspects themselves. So yeah, I mean, as a Chinese person, I feel it's just very offensive, and it definitely does not benefit, Asia or Chinese people or the Asian communities in Western countries, in these G7 countries. Because hatred, they do not, get reined in a certain small community, right? Because it definitely breaches these boundaries. When, for example, COVID first broke out, we see that so many people that are Asian looking were targeted as well. So, I mean, they just have to drop this really old and shabby game at throwing bad things that are ungrounded at China or Chinese people.
Yeah, you made a good point though. A lot of people in the West, and I don't blame them, but they can't tell the difference between different Asian people from different parts of Asia, whether it's East Asia, Southeast Asia. They can't tell if someone's Korean or Chinese or Japanese. And we saw that in a recent video on this channel reports on China, actually, where some Koreans and I think a Thai guy were attacked by an Australian when they were fishing, and he was just throwing some hideous anti-Chinese racial slurs at them. So people need to realize, especially Asian people, that this kind of rhetoric, it affects everybody. And I find it actually quite flabbergasting that kind of rhetoric will come from somebody like, what's his name again? Rishi Sunak, who's actually from one of the colonies. You know, he should understand what it's like and the risk he's putting, especially in those multicultural countries like the UK. He's putting a great number of the population at risk of violence. And we've seen massively increased anti-Asian violence in the US, where I think anti-China media reports are going on steroids. So I think it's really something they need to think more closely about, not just for the fact that it's bullcrap, but because it is affecting some of their own people. We have a comment down below from Mariam Norton, who says, US, NATO, EU, UK are a pretty big threat in my world. I totally agree. Let's read some more comments. Gaslighting. Gaslighting means that Rishi is farting too much. Okay. Somebody said, come on, he said social credit score -99. I think that's in relation to the story about Mr. What's his name? Uncle Roger, which we're going to be talking about very shortly. But yeah, we'll come back to that. Amazing how, this is from Pikachu 5M, amazing how the vassals show themselves by falling in line with the US narrative. It is very true. And that's what the G7 is all about. They're getting together to reinforce their narrative. And it's funny because every time they meet up, they always come up with these stupid plans that never get anywhere, especially plans that they hope will challenge in some way the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think is hilarious. For one, China and the rest of the world would benefit greatly if you also entered some kind of, or created some kind of system that helps developing countries develop. That would be a great thing. And the similar situation happened in the Pacific, where a quarter of the population were living in poverty. China came along and offered to help with security and a few other things. And Australia and New Zealand. Yeah, Australia and New Zealand kicked up a stink about it and then suddenly offered all this money to help. Well, that is great. If you want to help, you should help all along, and not just because China comes along and shows you up. So being good to your neighbors, respecting other countries is something that we should all be doing. And I don't know if you saw in the news recently about Papua New Guinea, Eric, with a security deal with the US.
I'm not personally very familiar with that case.
That's just new. We won't go into it because it's actually a big story that I need to do some more research on. But it's funny that the US and Australia and New Zealand kicked up such a big stink when China was going to help the Solomon Islands. And now the US has apparently entered into a security pact with Papua New Guinea, which is obviously a very impoverished developing nation to the north of Australia. So that is not in America's backyard by any means. And it's just double standards. I just want to quickly, before we move along to the next topic, I do have another tweet here by S.L. Kantan, who I think is another really awesome tweeter. Can you say tweeter? I guess so. He says, developed countries have been virtually stagnant since 2008, running on printed money. The G7 acts like it's the king of the world, but its contribution to the growth of the global economy has been smaller than that of China in recent years. The G6, that's the other countries, not including the US, contribution to the world's economic growth is just 6%. Maybe that's why they're called G6, 6%. Here's an IMF, International Monetary Fund, World Bank chart for 2013 to 2021. But the chart would be identical if you start from 2008. And you can see here, China contributed more to the world economic growth than the G7 combined. So check that out, and then you'll kind of understand why they're getting so desperate, I guess, Eric.
Yeah. I mean, the case like this usually reminds me of many ordinary bullying scenarios we come across in our daily life, right? Or even in fictions or films or TV series. These people who have been dominating the power hierarchy for, a few hundred years, right? They feel challenged by the actual strengths of another actor. and they just would not spare any efforts in unearthing or simply throwing slurs at that actor, whether that actor does something good or bad. And I always bear in mind one thing is that the G7 do not represent the so-called international community.
Not at all.
If you really respect a country and its people, respect a sovereign country, then they each has a vote, right? According to the more Western model of democracy, they each has a vote. So in this case, G7 is only 7 countries, and they usually, act out this play of, oh, all right, we have reached a consensus, and this would represent the whole world. And they seem to make these decisions independently, and they're not. I mean, I saw quite a few comments here that people are saying, for example, the G7s are not warmongering just to make sure that the whole world is under the US rule, something like that. So they do not actually act extremely independently like we think. And even when we talk about mainstream media in the general West, they're not absolutely independent and free media. They're receiving sponsorships. They're receiving support from many government-related actors or the capitalists or companies that are more or less involved in interest of the incumbent government. So how can you call that free if it's dependent on the financial support from other actors, other governmental actors? And then they would present themselves as free, which is something that we should use more caution, because they pretend to be free, and yet they form this actual unified matrix to bully another actor. And for many onlookers, it seems that it's just the people's voice, but it's not. They form alliance behind the curtain, yet claiming out there on the stage that they're independent and free and they represent the whole world, but they don't. Yeah,
that is a really funny meme. Actually, it's called. Let me find it. Let me bring it up. The real international community, you guys will know. Because what the US and countries like that, the US, Australia, and all of them will love to say is that they represent the international world order, or you need to follow the rules-based international order, or whatever bull crap that is. I can't find the meme, unfortunately, but basically it is such a terribly tiny size of the world. The US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, and then vassal states like Japan. They're the only ones that follow the so-called international rules-based order that the Western countries seem to love bleating on about. I think it's just a pack of crap, to be honest. And I think it's embarrassing. And even New Zealand's Prime Minister recently mentioned, in relation to China, I think, it was when Jacinda Ardern was still in power, she said, we're concerned that China is veering away from the international rules-based order. I just find it, how can they be so blind to the actual reality? And basically, they're like walking and talking memes. They should know more about the consensus outside of the terribly small group of nations that they represent. The vast majority of the world, and I don't want to get into the Russia situation because that is that'll open a whole nother can of worms that I'm not that willing to get into. But the whole, people say the world is against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You can be against it, but the fact of the matter is probably 80% or more of the world are not sanctioning Russia. They're still dealing with Russia. They're trying to get along. So I think it's just, it's time basically that the G7 and the international rules-based order, those kind of countries, including the US or headed by the US, really move aside, because we are moving at rapid pace towards the new world order. What's it called? I've forgotten the term. I think COVID has affected my brain. Anyway, we'll move along, Eric. I think I'm going to give you a short little break, and we're going to bring in my next guest, who's going to help me talk about the next topic, which I don't understand that well. So, Eric, I'll see you very shortly.